So I'm conscious of the fact that I'm standing between you and lunch, which is not quite as dangerous as standing between you and beer, but in an effort to take care of that, I will speak incomprehensibly fast, and you can consider that practice for Alex's presentation tomorrow. Good, that actually did work. I am projecting something now, and if I go, where's my other thingy? I want that one. And that, no, that's, I have forgotten how to make it do full screen, so never mind. I'm going to talk about XProc. It became a recommendation, 1.0 became a recommendation in 2010. We have a couple of different conformant implementations. I assume the EMC one is being used in their environment somehow. Mine is being used in some environments that positively terrify me, but we do have some significant deployments, so I think there's growing interest in it. We had a session yesterday morning, and we filled a room, so that's good. That's 2 years in a row we've filled a room. But there's some pretty obvious areas where it could be improved, and the working group is interested in working on another version, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We published a requirements document just a few months ago. We talked a lot about what possible requirements could be. There's lots of interesting things you can do with a pipeline engine, and it was hard to decide which ones made sense, and we didn't want to get into a situation where we knew we were embarking on an 8-year effort. It's much better to embark on a 1-year effort and have it take 8 years than embark on an 8-year effort and spend the rest of your life doing it. So we decided that the focus would be entirely usability improvements. No matter how cool the thing was, if we didn't think it would improve usability for pipeline authors, we set that aside for some possible future version, I suppose. We came up with about 20 requirements, roughly divided in half between things we think we must do and things we think we could do or should do. The should ones are principally less technical or things that sound like a good idea but may turn out not to be implementable. So this is a pipeline. If you're not familiar with XProc, this is a simple pipeline. It says, I have one input document that comes in, and I'm going to perform XInclude on that input document, and then I'm going to transform it with XSLT using the docbook style sheets, and I'm going to produce one result document. Presumably, I'm ignoring the secondary result documents here. And that's all well and good, except the docbook style sheets have about a gazillion parameters. There are parameters to control all sorts of things, and if you had to enumerate them in your pipeline, if the way that you did this was you made every single option, every single parameter that you could possibly send to XSLT an option on your pipeline, you'd have something that was utterly unusable. And so we have another way of dealing with that, another way of dealing with parameters. So a brief aside, let me tell me what this pipeline actually does. Anybody? Going once, going twice? It fails with a static error because there's no magic parameter input port declared, and the XSLT step requires a magic parameter input port. And so what you actually have to write is something like this. There is some syntactic sugar so that you don't always have to write it out like this, but this is what the full thing looks like. And at this point, you've already lost 90% of the people trying to learn XProc because it's just too confusing. It does have the nice feature that, in fact, parameters, you can have different parameter ports on different XSLT steps, so you can, in fact, do a lot of complicated things with it. But in fact, this notion of using parameters that pass semi-magically through a different kind of input port turns out to be really non-obvious and difficult to use. It was the best of the possible solutions we came up with in 1.0. Having decided in 1.0 that we needed to support the XSLT case, we needed a solution for this, the working group spent months and months and months and months looking at possible answers and hating all of them, and this is the one we hated least, and I now hate it as much as all the others. Maybe it's not worth doing at all. Maybe in reality people don't need to pass stuff through to XSLT that they don't know about. It certainly isn't something I've used very often myself. But maybe we can do better. I actually think the working group doesn't have even a idea for what the right answer here is yet, I think. But my current thinking personally is that we can probably leverage maps. We can probably adopt XSLT or XPath 3.0 maps in the language and use maps to do some of this in a way that's less awful, but we'll see. Another significant thing I think we need to do is provide some mechanism for putting non-XML documents flow through pipelines. In the 1.0 time frame, we wanted to be done fast. We thought we might be finished before XSLT2 when we started. And we put some constraints on ourselves, and one of them was that it was just going to be simpler if we didn't deal with that problem in 1.0. XML documents only was a nice, clean platform to build on. But in fact, users want to do things with EPUB, and they want zip files to flow through, and they want to do a little bit of image manipulation. They want to scale images for the various kinds of EPUBs and things. So I think if we want to broaden XProc's appeal, we need a better answer to that. And we've got a couple of good proposals. I don't think it's actually going to be that challenging, really. But another obvious improvement is to support value templates. So the top line there is the href attribute, and the load statement there, the load instruction, is a syntactic shortcut for the lower form, which is an href option that you pass a select expression to. And I was reminded earlier this week, or last week, depending on when you think the weekends, that the shortcut form is so common and familiar that there are people who forget the long form exists. And so I think what people really want to do is put the expression in the href attribute, but that doesn't work. That gives you that attempts to get you the document resolve, open paren, et cetera, and that's not what you meant. So the long form when you have an expression looks just like the long form when you don't, but it would obviously be cleaner to have curly braces in there. So I think AVTs in the shortcut form of step options is a no-brainer. Text value templates is a possibility as well. We invented a p:\template step sort of after 1.0 in order to provide this kind of support for making documents and building documents. The problem with the p:\template step is that it uses parameters, so it's sort of awful in a number of ways. And if we supported text value templates either in the XQuery style or the XSLT style, I'm not sure which, we could conceivably add that to 2.0 as well. It's an interesting implementation burden. One of the other things we did in XProc 1.0 was made it possible to implement the language without ever examining select expressions. The select expressions, you don't ever have to look for variables in them. The variables can't have anything to do with the control flow. And that's obviously not going to be true if we go to doing AVTs and things. So. Another sort of no-brainer, it turns out that the order of steps in a pipeline, or the order of steps in the pipeline document is largely irrelevant. If you want to put them all in backwards order and chain them together explicitly, that's fine. The processor will then turn them around and run them in the other order. The dependency is that any step B that depends on the output of step A means that you can be guaranteed the processor will run A before B, or at least will finish B before it finishes A. But there are steps for which it is at best inconvenient, if not impossible, to arrange for that sort of control flow. I mean, if you want to create a directory, you have an extension step that creates a directory in the file system. Making the XSLT step that comes next depend somehow on the output of that step just seems kind of silly. And both of the implementations that I know of have a simple attribute mechanism for saying, look, independent of whatever other analysis you may have done, I depend on that step. And so I think we need to do something along those lines. I joked, we were serious that we thought we might finish before XSLT 2.0 when we started. And so we thought that support for XPath 1.0 was a requirement. We also at the time had an implementer who wanted to build a 1.0 implementation based on having the individual stages be separate Unix programs in the pipeline. But I don't think 1.0 is worth the effort anymore. I think we should just say that XProc V.next will require the XPath data model version 2 or possibly version 3. We also said, again, one of these things that we just did for simplicity, we said, look, variables and parameters are always strings. We always take the string value of nodes. We don't allow you to pass nodes around. I actually thought that was silly right near the end of the standardization process and attempted to get the working group to relax that restriction for 1.0. And working groups have a cadence. They're organisms, and the organism was not prepared to entertain that sort of change that late in the day, and so that got shot down. I have an extension to my implementation that does it. It's not hard. It just I think we need to not do that. I think we need to allow any XDM value to be the value of a parameter or an option. I will not read you all of the possible syntactic simplifications. There are a whole bunch of them. XProc has some syntactic shortcuts, and it has long form, the very explicit ways of expressing things, and sort of nothing in between. And I think that was a reasonable thing to do in 1.0, trying to figure out what all the dependencies would be and what shortcuts would actually be easier for people to understand. Would have added time to get the work done, and we didn't want to take the time. But I think the experience we've had so far suggests that there are quite a few things we could do that would make writing pipelines less verbose and make people happier. If you're going to allow non-XML documents to flow through the pipeline, then you need some way, some sort of annotation, some sort of metadata about the documents flowing through the pipeline to say whether they're XML or not. I mean, one obvious way would be to associate the content type of the document with the document as it's flowing through. Well, in the principle that there are three numbers in computer science, 0, 1, and an arbitrary number, if you're going to allow that association, maybe you could use that feature for other things. One of the unfortunate deficiencies in XProc at the moment is if you have an XSLT step that specifies some serialization parameters. Maybe it specifies HTML5 serialization in some particular encoding. That information is lost in the pipeline context. That document comes out and goes through the identity step or something and is eventually serialized with whatever serialization options the pipeline says it should use. And if you have different style sheets that have different serialization parameters, that's inconvenient. Perhaps we could take those options from the XSLT style sheet, put them in the metadata, and then when we go to serialize, have an option that says, look, serialize with whatever the metadata properties say you should do. And maybe we should let users stick arbitrary metadata in there as well. I don't know. I think now we're off out of the must requirements and into the should requirements. There are, for most steps, an obvious number of inputs and outputs. The identity step takes a document in and puts a document out. The XSLT step takes a document, actually takes several documents, I got that wrong. It takes a document and a style sheet, or a series of style sheets, or a series of documents, and produces a primary result document and a sequence of secondary result documents. So again, it has a sort of fixed number of inputs and outputs. But then there are steps like split sequence, which currently have exactly 2 outputs, but it wouldn't be hard at all to imagine having a split sequence that produced more than 2, and a hypothetical eval statement that allowed you to run an arbitrary pipeline would need to be able to express that its inputs and outputs were the same as the inputs and outputs for the pipeline you're running. And so some mechanism of specifying a dynamic number of input and output ports is probably worth investigating. Pipelines are kind of a pain in the neck to debug. I'm working on a V2 implementation that runs steps in parallel, and that makes it worse. You can log outputs, and implementations have produced some sort of a message step. I think we can probably do better, and we should think hard about how we can do better. The ability in the MarkLogic server to load XQuery functions into an XSLT context or load XSLT functions into an XQuery context turns out to be really handy. I hope the XSLT and XQuery working groups can get that sorted. I believe that action item is mine and due Monday. So it's clear that it's nice to be able to do this. XProc has XPath expressions. Intuition suggests that it would be convenient if you could define functions in XQuery or XSLT and then load them up and use them in your expressions in XProc. I actually did an extension to do that just to see if it worked. There were some RDFA documents that I wanted to handle, and I had some XQuery functions for doing that, and it was convenient to be able to just call them from the pipeline. So, and then that opens the question, well, could you arrange it so that a pipeline was in fact callable as a function? If a step had 1 input and 1 output, why not make it available as a function, as a function syntax to call from somewhere else? I don't know if that's plausible or not. Try-catch in XProc is missing the ability to catch different kinds of errors. I think we should add that. And there's been some use cases where having a finally clause would be handy. Once you've decided that you don't care about XPath 1.0 anymore and you're going to have XDM so that you've got a sort of consistent data model, then you can ask questions like, should the for each instruction which currently, the for each step, which currently operates on a sequence of documents, be able to operate over nodes that aren't documents? Should you be able to pass it element children and operate on them? What about things that aren't nodes? Should you be able to do a p:: for each step that sums a sequence of integers or something? I think that's worth considering, although by no means obviously the right thing to do. So that's the end. I think I managed to catch up. And please read the requirements document and send in your comments. Thank you very much.